This is a video dealing with inspector calls, and particularly what I refer to as section 3, Sheila's story. Now, what I mean by that is going from the moment when Sheila is shown the photograph by the inspector, so pretty much the first moment at which the inspector has an impact on Sheila, through to the end of Act 1 when it shifts over towards Gerald. Now, Sheila is an important character, as we know, and this is an important moment in dealing with her. And what I always think about Sheila is that sometimes this idea that she changes is a little bit too simplistic. We saw in section 1 and section 2 there are a number of moments that kind of show that there's two sides to her at the moment, that she seems to be undergoing some kind of internal conflict between the person she's expected to be and the person she actually is. So I think it's more that that person that she actually is begins to come out under the influence of the inspector, and hopefully we'll see that as we begin to go through this. Now we start with the photograph. This is the moment at which the inspector shows her the photograph. She's the second of 3 people who see it, and her reaction is quite different, and that's one of the key ideas of it. Her sensitivity to what she's being shown is very different from that of Arthur and from later on of Sybil when she's shown the photograph, and even of Gerald and Eric to a degree when they realise what they've done. And that sensitivity starts off with her immediate reaction in the stage directions to the photograph, where she recognises the photograph and gives a little cry, a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. Now, first of all, I think the important thing is to see the emotion with which she responds, showing genuine feeling, of course. And then that even though she does run out at this point, even though she does try and run away from what she's done, it's literally a minute or two before she comes back in and takes full responsibility. So it's almost like that conflict between her runs out of the room and what comes back in is only her true self, ready to learn and understand. So that's something you can draw out of this idea, but I would also notice that that detail is there in the little cry and the half-stifled sob. The idea that in both cases we've got a cry, a sob, we've got an emotional reaction, but for both of them we've got an attempt to make them smaller and less important than they appear to be. Try to stifle one. A cry that's small. Well, stifling's only half stifling as well. So trying to hold it in, maybe as she feels she should, but actually failing to do so. Now, before she comes back in, of course, the rest of this section deals with, first of all, her father, and then with Gerald and Eric. Now, her father, first of all, his reaction is anger, as it so often is, asking the inspector, why the devil do you want to go upsetting a child like that? And of course, you know, as well as his anger, it's interesting the attitude he's taking to her. Obviously, first of all, he refers to her as a child. We see that repeatedly throughout the play, that Arthur and Sybil both refer to their children as children, rather than recognising that they're in their 20s. And it's even more so that it's the child rather than even my child. I mean, not really taking ownership, as though that's what she is. It's a definition of who she is. And I think that kind of goes with Berling's attitude to his daughter the whole way through. I don't think he ever really sees her as anything beyond just a young child who doesn't really know or understand anything, especially female. Now, as he then retorts and, you know, attacks the inspector, what we see is the inspector come back at him. Now, this is a mirror of what he says to the inspector when he's trying to make his point that they were having a nice little celebration here and you've come in and a fine mess you've made of it. And so the inspector just turns his words on him, as he has done elsewhere, comparing the idea of a promising life with their family celebration. And we all can see very clearly what's more important of those. And remind himself that somebody else is responsible for messing it up. As Burling leaves, we're left with Gerald and Eric. Eric has his slightly strange interaction where he seems to be getting angry and then just says he's had a few drinks and wants to go to bed. But Gerald's response is much more easy. You know, he's trying to say to the inspector, look, you know, you're being a bit harsh here on us all. And he comes up with this idea that after all, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. And it's one of those lines where Priestley is throwing in your face a sense of what's to come and what we really should notice here. And of course allows the inspector to come back at him on it. When Sheila then returns, as I've said, it seems to be a different Sheila who comes back in. One of the first things she says on the way back in is she says that she has told her father, she's told Arthur, what she did. Now, of course, we're about to find out what she did, and it is pretty awful. It's petty, and it's ridiculous, and it's childish. And it really does impact on somebody's life badly, purely because she was in a bad mood. But she tells her father, and he doesn't seem to think it's important. Doesn't think it amounted to much. And I think that tells us as much about Burling in some ways as his response to what he did. I can't see that anyone else in the family would look at what Sheila's done and say, well, what's wrong with that? And then we get, of course, her taking that full level of responsibility, in fact, too much responsibility, that she is really responsible for it. And the inspector corrects her and points out, not entirely, but of course doesn't let her get away with it. But it does show again the very big difference between Arthur, who said, I cannot take any responsibility when he understands what has happened, and her saying, I'm really responsible. And we see the difference. So if we move on to her story itself, and the details in there, it's less what happens, but more some of the ways it's expressed around there. Because we're seeing a development of this idea that in direct contrast to her father, she is taking on full responsibility. First of all, we've got this breakdown, maybe of the relationship is the best way to put it, between her and Gerald. Whereas before, there hasn't really been, I suppose, apart from the tiny little implications of half playful, half serious, there hasn't really been any conflict between them. We in fact had them staring lovingly into each other's eyes, talking about drinking to each other. Well, here she turns on him quite suddenly, and so suddenly that he is surprised himself that she does so. And this idea of at least I'm trying to tell the truth is something you could possibly look a little deeper into. Why did she do to say that to Gerald? Gerald hasn't said anything about Daisy Renton at this point. Is it again another thing that shows that she's carrying with her this idea that he's lying about what he did last summer? As she tells the story, I think the most important thing to note is how all the way through she never shirks any kind of responsibility or even any way of putting herself in a bad light. Explaining here that she couldn't be sorry for Eva because she was very pretty and looked like she could take care of herself. I mean, it's almost like an analysis of the character, that other side of her. You know, the idea of thinking that somebody like that could take care of themselves and responding to the fact they were pretty. Just like when she asked about her being pretty before. Kind of, it's almost like she is pulling apart the selfishness and ridiculousness of some of her past behaviour. This is then developed in her reactions to the inspector. When he says, or accuses her of being jealous, you know, an accusation people don't generally take very well. She just agrees. When he says, you used the power you had against her, she again just says yes. There's no shirking of any kind of responsibility at all. Not that the inspector lets her get away with it just because she does that. There's no soft soaping her at this point, as he says to her, when she says, I wish I could take it back, I wish I hadn't done it yet. He says, and notably harshly, you can't, it's too late, she's dead. There is no way, just because she's taken responsibility, she gets away with it. So again, we see this point. You need to take responsibility, but that doesn't make you somebody who then everyone can pat on the back and say, well done. It's something you have to hold on to in all its horribleness. As Inspector carries on and moves this forward, an important point that he makes is the idea that he's searching for why this happened, which does distinguish him straight away from the usual idea of inspectors at this point coming round, where they're trying to establish what happens. So we move on from her story towards the end bit, which of course where Gerald gives himself away right at the end, which allows us to segue into the next person here. And I would argue that if we're not suspicious of Gerald even before he does that, we're not watching very closely. His immediate reaction to hearing the name Daisy Renton is to say, what, startled? Which not only is him being caught out and serves a plot purpose, but does also suggest how important that name is to him, that he reacts that way. And then his attempt to organise himself again. It's the beginning of this attempt to cover up what he's done. It's a strange thing to ask if he can have a drink. I suppose it's not his house, so that would make sense in his own ways. But Eric's there. It again seems like he's pushing himself in a particular direction to try and distract from what he's just done. Then we've got his, well, they're not really denials, are they? And this is the point. Gerald doesn't lie, but he comes as close as you possibly can without actually doing it. He just tries to evade the truth. Do you know Eva Smith? How did you know Eva Smith? I didn't. All right, Daisy Renton then. She gets it immediately. It's the same thing. Why should I have known her? You obviously knew her. You did that. All right, I knew her. Let's leave it at that. This seems to be the way that he wants to deal with it. Push it to one side. Not lie, but push it away. Just like with the suggestion of, do you mind if I give myself a drink, Sheila? He doesn't... I don't know what he's expecting to achieve. I mean, it's quite obvious he's not going to get away with it. But even when she accuses him by saying, is that who you were seeing last summer? He just goes silent. He can't even bring himself to say yes then. So it does tell us something about Gerald's character, I feel. Not replying in that situation. It's interesting. It's very much a technique Mrs. Burling uses later. But I don't think here he thinks he's actually going to get away with it. It's almost like he won't say the words. And then moves into this idea of trying to enlist Sheila in keeping it from the inspector. Again, I suppose, showing how much wrongdoing he feels he's done. But also, again, another example of somebody with privilege thinking that they are kind of above the law and can push it away from them. Yet the very end of this act is designed to show us how far Sheila has come. From somebody who, quarter of an hour, 20 minutes ago, was toasting him, delighted by the ring, happy that it was a ring that he got. She's now almost triumphant at his reactions, okay? Or maybe not his reactions, at the fact that she's got the truth out of him and he is crushed. I think there's often a way you can see that Sheila and Gerald's relationship is a bit of a power game. I think the ring goes that way. The 3 times the ring is given out feels like some kind of power game. It's an ownership thing very much when he gives it to her and he's decided it, and he possesses her. When she gives it back to him, it's again very much her taking control, her saying, as she does, we're not the same people. not rejecting him because of what he's done as much as the fact that she understands things. And then his attempt to ensnare her again at the end, which is all very ambiguous. This feels like a power game between the two of them. And it does tell us something about what's going on under the surface, maybe. So the next stage isn't Gerald's story, because one thing Priestley does is he pushes that to the back for a little bit. A fairly straightforward but effective dramatic technique. Gerald spends his time trying to get rid of Sheila, get her out of the room while he gives the details. And then the masterstroke of in comes Sybil again. And she's going to completely turn everything around in terms of the atmosphere and the mood and the feeling here, while we wait to find out what Gerald actually did.